The rain poured steadily, turning the street slick with a sheen of water. The world was gray and cold, the kind of day that left people huddled inside warm houses or under umbrellas, trying their best to keep the world at bay. But there he was, a small boy, standing on the doorstep of a grand mansion, his thin shoulders hunched, his damp hair plastered to his forehead. His name was Liam. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, his frame so slight it looked as though a strong wind might blow him away. He clutched a small bouquet of flowers, wild ones he'd picked earlier from a field not far from the orphanage. Now they were drooping, crushed slightly from the way he held them, but they were still bright enough to stand out against the gloom. For a moment, Liam hesitated, staring at the towering wooden door in front of him. It was heavy, painted black, with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head that gleamed even in the rain. It looked like it belonged to another world entirely, one Liam had no right to be part of. He shifted on his feet, his shoes soaked through, the cold water seeping between his toes. His fingers trembled as he reached out and pressed the doorbell. The chime rang inside, loud and melodic. Liam imagined the sound traveling through the mansion's halls, bouncing off the marble floors and tall ceilings. He thought about the people inside, the ones with warm clothes, warm food, and nothing to worry about. People who didn't know what it felt like to sleep on a thin cot in a drafty room surrounded by other orphans. A moment later, the door opened. A tall man in a black suit stood there, his expression stern and disapproving. He was a butler, though Liam didn't know that word. To Liam, he was just another adult who didn't want him there. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice sharp. Liam swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the flowers. He looked past the man, into the house beyond. For just a second, he caught a glimpse of the inside. A grand foyer with a glittering chandelier, a sweeping staircase, and people dressed in beautiful clothes, laughing and holding glasses of sparkling drinks. It was like something out of a dream. I wanted to see Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," Liam stammered. His voice was soft, almost drowned out by the rain. "Please, just for a minute." The butler's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more annoyed. "And what business could you possibly have with Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore?" Liam held up the flowers. They looked smaller and sadder now, droplets of rain sliding off the petals. "I wanted to say thank you." For his voice trailed off as he struggled to find the words. "Just, please." The butler snorted softly, a sound that made Liam's cheeks burn. "Wait here." He stepped back inside and shut the door, leaving Liam alone on the doorstep once more. Liam's breath fogged in front of him as he exhaled, shivering in the cold. His fingers were starting to go numb. He glanced down at the flowers, their bright yellow and pink colors now muted under the rain. Inside the mansion, voices murmured and footsteps echoed. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. This time, the butler wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, dressed in a silk gown that shimmered even in the dull light. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant style, and her lips were painted a deep red. She looked like a queen, beautiful and untouchable. It was Catherine Whitmore. Her blue eyes swept over Liam, and for a brief moment, her perfectly painted lips curled into a frown. "What is this?" she asked, her voice clipped. The butler cleared his throat. "He says he wishes to thank you, madam." Catherine arched a perfectly shaped brow. "Thank us? For what?" Liam opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. He felt so small under her gaze, so insignificant. He knew he looked pitiful. His clothes were threadbare, his shoes falling apart, his face pale from the cold. The flowers in his hand looked ridiculous now, as if they didn't belong in a place like this. I just wanted to give you these," he finally managed, holding out the bouquet. His voice was barely a whisper. Catherine stared at the flowers like they were something dirty, something offensive. "Is this a joke?" "No, ma'am," Liam said quickly, his heart pounding. "I wanted to thank you for helping us at the orphanage. I heard you made a donation, and I wanted to say thank you. That's all." For a second, there was silence. Catherine exchanged a look with the butler, something between annoyance and amusement. "A donation," she repeated, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. "Richard, did you hear this?" Another voice echoed from inside the house. "Hear what?" A man appeared beside Catherine, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair silver at the temples. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his tie knotted so neatly it looked like it had never been touched. This was Richard Whitmore. "What's going on here?" Richard asked, his tone impatient. "This boy," Catherine said, gesturing toward Liam as though he were a stain on her expensive carpet, "says he came to thank us for our donation to the orphanage." Richard looked down at Liam, his brow furrowing slightly. "What orphanage?" Liam blinked in confusion. "The one where I live, sir. I heard you donated money to help us." I just wanted to say thank you." For a moment, Richard didn't respond. He looked at Catherine, then at the butler, then back at Liam. Finally, he let out a short, humorless laugh. "I think you're mistaken, boy," Richard said, his tone dismissive. "We don't make donations to places like that." The words hit Liam like a punch to the stomach. He stared up at Richard, the man's cold expression blurring slightly as tears welled in Liam's eyes. But I thought..." "Clearly, you were wrong," Catherine said sharply. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a party to get back to." Liam opened his mouth to say something. Anything, but the butler stepped forward, blocking him from the doorway. "You've wasted enough of their time, boy," he said, his voice low and firm. "Please," Liam whispered, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to say thank you." The butler ignored him. With a final sneer, he shut the door in Liam's face. The sound of the door closing echoed in Liam's ears, loud and final. He stood there on the doorstep, frozen in place, the rain soaking him to the bone. The flowers slipped from his numb fingers and landed on the wet ground, petals breaking apart in the puddle that had formed around his feet. For a long time, Liam didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the closed door, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. Finally, he turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and heavy. The mansion loomed behind him, its windows glowing with warm, golden light. It felt like a whole other world, one he would never be part of. As Liam trudged through the rain, he whispered softly to himself, one day, I'll show them." The rain didn't let up as Liam walked back toward the orphanage, his clothes heavy and dripping. Every step felt harder than the last, his small feet squelching in his soaked shoes. The streets were nearly empty now, the world around him shrouded in gray. He pulled his thin coat tighter around his shoulders, though it did little to keep the cold out. When he finally reached the orphanage, the old crumbling building loomed before him like a shadow. The paint on the walls was peeling, the windows fogged and cracked. It wasn't much, but to Liam, it was home, or the closest thing he had to one. He pushed open the creaky front door, the sound echoing through the hallway. Inside, it was noisy as always, children's voices shouting, footsteps running up and down the stairs, the occasional cry of a baby from one of the smaller rooms. "Liam!" He froze, turning to see Mrs. Holloway, the head caretaker of the orphanage, striding toward him. She was a stout woman with tired eyes, her apron stained from a long day of cooking and cleaning. "Where have you been?" she demanded, frowning deeply. "You're soaking wet. Look at you, your shoes, your coat," she sighed, exasperated. "Come on, get inside before you catch your death." "I'm sorry," Liam mumbled, his voice small. Mrs. Holloway softened slightly, though her tone remained stern. "Go upstairs and change. I'll see if there's anything left from dinner." Liam nodded and trudged up the narrow, creaking staircase, his wet clothes leaving a trail of water behind him. When he reached the small room he shared with 3 other boys, he pushed the door open quietly, hoping not to wake anyone. But the other boys were still awake, huddled together on one of the beds, whispering loudly about something Liam couldn't hear. "Where were you?" one of them asked as Liam entered, his tone accusatory. Liam ignored the question and sat down on his cot, tugging off his wet shoes and socks. The boys stared at him, waiting for an answer. "You were probably out begging," another boy said, snickering. "Trying to get rich people to feel sorry for you." Liam looked up sharply, his face flushing. "I wasn't begging." "Then what were you doing?" Liam hesitated. He thought about telling them the truth, that he'd gone to the mansion to say thank you. But the memory of Richard and Catherine's cold, dismissive faces stopped him. They wouldn't understand. They'd laugh, just like everyone else. "Nothing," he muttered, pulling his knees up to his chest. The boys snickered again before turning back to their conversation, leaving Liam alone on his cot. He stared out the small, cracked window, watching the rain slide down the glass in thin, crooked lines. His chest still ached from the rejection, the sharp sting of Richard Whitmore's words replaying over and over in his mind. "We don't make donations to places like that." Liam clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. It wasn't fair. Why did people like Richard and Catherine get to live in mansions while he slept in a cold, drafty room? Why did they have everything while he had nothing? But even as the anger burned in his chest, it was quickly replaced by something else, determination. One day, he whispered to himself, his voice quiet but steady. One day, I'll show them. The days that followed blurred together into a haze of routine. Liam woke up early every morning, helped Mrs. Holloway with the younger children, and went to school with the other boys from the orphanage. He kept his head down, avoided drawing attention to himself, and spent most of his time alone. At school, the other kids ignored him, or worse, they teased him. They called him charity case or street rat, laughing at his worn clothes and scuffed shoes. Liam learned to block out their voices, focusing instead on his schoolwork. Because that was the one thing Liam had, his mind. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was smart. Smarter than most of the kids in his class. He spent hours in the school library, devouring books about anything and everything. History, science, math, he couldn't get enough. He taught himself things the teachers didn't even cover, scribbling notes in the margins of old, yellowed textbooks. And every night, when the orphanage was quiet and the other boys were asleep, Liam would sit on his cot with small notebook and stub of a pencil, writing down his dreams. Dreams of escaping the orphanage. Dreams of building something of his own. Dreams of proving to people like Richard and Catherine Whitmore that he wasn't just some urchin who could be dismissed and forgotten. One afternoon, months later, Liam sat in the school library, hunched over a book about inventions. The pages were filled with sketches of machines, things Liam couldn't even begin to understand, but he studied them anyway, fascinated. Still hiding in here, huh? Liam tensed at the sound of the voice. He looked up to see Michael, one of the older boys from the orphanage, leaning against the library shelves with a smirk on his face. Michael was bigger than Liam, stronger, and he always made sure everyone knew it. I'm not hiding, Liam said quietly, looking back down at his book. Michael snorted. Sure you're not. He sauntered over and grabbed the book from Liam's hands, flipping through the pages carelessly. What's this? You think you're going to be some kind of genius inventor or something? Give it back, Liam said, his voice firm. Michael laughed. Or what? What are you going to do about it? Just give it back, Liam said again, his voice shaking slightly. Michael held the book out of reach, grinning as Liam stood up and tried to grab it. You'll never be anything, you know that? Michael taunted. You're just an orphan. Nobody cares about you. Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit, but he didn't let Michael see. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his eyes hardening. You're wrong, Liam said quietly. Michael's smirk faltered slightly. What did you say? I said you're wrong, Liam repeated, his voice louder this time. I will be something. You'll see. Michael stared at him for a moment before shoving the book back into Liam's chest. You're delusional, he muttered, turning and walking away. Liam sat back down, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the book again. He stared at the pages, the words blurring in front of him. You'll never be anything. The words echoed in his mind, but this time, they didn't hurt as much. Because Liam knew they weren't true. He thought about his dreams, the notebook full of ideas, the books he studied late into the night. He thought about the mansion, about the way Richard and Catherine Whitmore had looked at him like he was nothing. He wouldn't let their words define him. He wouldn't let anyone's words define him. One day, Liam whispered to himself, gripping the book tightly. One day, I'll prove them all wrong. The years passed like pages turning in a book, slow at first, then faster as Liam grew older. He wasn't the small, timid boy anymore. By the time he turned 15, Liam had become something of an enigma at the orphanage. He was quiet but not afraid. He was thin but carried himself tall. And most of all, he was focused. While the other kids played or argued, Liam worked. He cleaned, he studied, he earned. Whatever small job he could find, he took, sweeping floors in shops, stacking books at the library, even polishing shoes on the street corner. Every coin he earned, he saved. His most prized possession was still his notebook, though now it was worn and filled with scribbled ideas, dreams, and plans. Late at night, when the rest of the orphanage was silent, he'd open it up and run his fingers over the pages. In his mind, Liam knew exactly where he wanted to go, even if no one else could see it yet. One chilly morning, Liam stood on a crowded street corner, a rag in hand as he polished a gentleman's shoes. The man barely noticed him, his eyes fixed on the newspaper he held. Liam worked quickly and carefully, the movements practiced after years of doing the same job. "Not bad, boy," the man said gruffly when Liam finished. He dropped the coin into Liam's outstretched hand and walked off without another word. Liam pocketed the coin, his eyes drifting toward the center of the city where tall buildings gleamed in the morning sunlight. Men in suits rushed back and forth, carrying briefcases and speaking into telephones. To Liam, they looked like the kings of the world, untouchable, powerful. He turned and made his way to the library, the one place in the city where he felt like he belonged. The librarian, a kind older woman named Mrs. Kearns, always greeted him with a smile. "Back again, Liam?" she asked as he entered. Liam nodded, his hands tucked into the pockets of his threadbare coat. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Kearns beamed. "I've saved a book for you. It just came in." She disappeared behind a desk and returned with a thick, leather-bound book about business and finance. Liam's eyes widened as he took it from her hands. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice full of awe. "You're welcome," Mrs. Kearns replied warmly. "You remind me of my son when he was your age. He always had his nose in a book, too." Liam smiled faintly and carried the book to a table by the window. He sat down, flipping through the pages with careful hands. The words were complicated, full of terms he didn't quite understand, but that didn't matter. He would teach himself, just as he always had. At the orphanage, the other boys still mocked him sometimes. "Liam and his silly books," they'd say, rolling their eyes as he scribbled notes in his worn notebook. "What's the point, Liam? No one cares how smart you are." Liam never responded. He didn't have to. Late at night, when the room was dark and quiet, he would whisper his dreams to himself, like a secret no one else was allowed to hear. "I'll build something one day. I'll be someone. And when I do, they'll know." He thought of the mansion. He thought of Richard and Catherine Whitmore and the way they had looked at him, like he didn't exist. That memory was his fuel, his fire. By the time Liam turned 18, he was ready. The orphanage had no choice but to release him. A boy of age, they said, though they gave him nothing but a handshake and a thin coat to keep him warm. Mrs. Holloway had softened in her later years and handed him an envelope with a small amount of money she'd set aside. "Don't waste it," she warned, though there was kindness in her voice. "I won't," Liam promised. The city was colder now, its streets busier and louder than ever. But Liam wasn't afraid. He found a small, cramped room in the poorest part of town, the rent barely enough to cover the leaking ceiling and sagging floorboards. He didn't mind. It was his. During the day, he worked long hours doing anything he could find. At night, he read. He borrowed books from the library, studying them under the weak glow of a single lamp. He taught himself everything he needed to know about business, economics, and investments. And when he wasn't reading, he was planning. The dreams he'd written in his notebook all those years ago were no longer just dreams. They were goals now, tangible things that he could see and reach for. Liam's first break came when he overheard a conversation at the factory where he worked. Two men in suits were arguing loudly about an opportunity no one wanted, an old warehouse on the edge of town that the owner was desperate to sell. "It's worthless," one of them said. "Nothing but bricks and dust." "But it's cheap," the other countered. Someone could turn a profit on it if they knew what to do. Liam listened carefully, every word sparking something in his mind. That night, he scribbled furiously in his notebook, outlining an idea that had taken root. He didn't have the money to buy the warehouse, not yet, but that didn't stop him. For weeks, he saved every penny he earned, eating the bare minimum and sleeping with his coat pulled tight against the cold. Then, when he had enough for a down payment, he approached the warehouse owner himself. The man was skeptical at first, staring at Liam's thin frame and patched clothes. "What's a kid like you want with a place like this?" Liam's voice was calm but firm. "I see what it could be, sir. Not just what it is." The owner studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." Liam took the keys to the warehouse with shaking hands, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Liam poured everything he had into the warehouse. He cleaned it, repaired what he could, and rented out small spaces to local businesses looking for affordable storage. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Slowly, he began to turn a profit. The first time he counted out his earnings, Liam couldn't help but smile. It was a small stack of bills, nothing compared to the riches of the Whitmores, but to Liam, it meant everything. He was building something. And he wasn't done yet. The warehouse was just the beginning. Liam's mind was constantly turning, working, planning. He reinvested every penny he made, taking small risks that slowly began to pay off. By the time he was 20, Liam had moved out of the small, sagging room and rented a slightly better apartment in a quieter part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was a place where he could look out the window and see the world unfolding below him. His name started to circulate quietly among local business owners. They called him sharp, clever, and focused. He was young, yes, but Liam had a reputation for spotting opportunities no one else could see. People started coming to him for advice, asking for his opinion on investments and properties they'd overlooked. And Liam gave it freely, never asking for much in return. He built relationships, trusting that his time would come. One day, while Liam was walking through the market, he overheard two businessmen discussing a failed textile factory on the outskirts of the city. Useless, one man grumbled, shaking his head. It's been shut down for months. No one's interested in buying it, and the owner's desperate to sell. Liam slowed his steps, his ears catching every word. Desperate to sell. That's what I heard, the man replied. Whoever buys it will need a miracle to make it profitable again. Liam didn't hear the rest of their conversation. His mind was already racing. The textile factory was a massive building, abandoned, neglected, and covered in layers of dust and grime. But Liam didn't see what it was. He saw what it could be. He spent the next 2 weeks meeting with a factory owner, negotiating a deal. Liam didn't have all the money, not yet, but he convinced the man to give him a chance. "You won't regret this," Liam promised, his voice steady. The owner stared at him skeptically, but something in Liam's eyes must have struck a chord. He agreed. The factory was Liam's now, or at least it would be once he'd made enough to pay it off. Liam worked harder than ever. He spent days and nights cleaning the factory, fixing what he could, and hiring a small team of workers who were just as eager for an opportunity as he was. At first, the progress was slow. There were days when Liam wondered if he'd made a mistake. He lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, the weight of his decisions pressing on his chest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He partnered with local textile suppliers and secured contracts to produce cloth at affordable prices. Liam was smart. He undercut the larger factories, offering better deals to local merchants. Within months, orders began pouring in. The machines roared back to life, the hum of productivity filling the factory like music. Liam's small team grew, and with it, so did his reputation. People began to talk about the young man with the factory, the one who had turned a dying business into something remarkable. Business owners who had once ignored him now shook his hand and asked him how he'd done it. Liam's success snowballed. He paid off the factory in full, then expanded, purchasing another property to keep up with demand. By the time he turned 22, Liam wasn't just a businessman. He was an entrepreneur, a leader, someone the community respected. One afternoon, Liam sat in his office overlooking the factory floor. The windows were large, letting in the afternoon sunlight, and the rhythmic sound of machines filled the air. Liam leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the ledger in front of him. The numbers were strong, stronger than he dared to hope. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Liam called. The door opened, and Mr. Hawthorne, one of the factory's senior managers, stepped inside. "Mr. Liam, sir, you've got a visitor." Liam raised an eyebrow. "A visitor?" Hawthorne nodded. "Says he's from the city council. Something about a charity gala next month." Liam frowned slightly, but nodded. "Send him in." Moments later, a man in a crisp suit entered the office, his expression polite but guarded. He extended a hand. "Mr. Liam, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name's Robert Ashford, and I'm organizing the annual charity gala for the council." Liam shook his hand, still wary. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ashford?" "Well," Ashford began, clearing his throat, "we've heard a lot about you recently, your work with the factory, your rise in the business world. You've become quite the success story, Mr. Liam." Liam inclined his head, waiting for the man to continue. "The council hosts a charity gala every year," Ashford explained. "It's a prestigious event, an opportunity for the city's most prominent individuals to gather and, well, give back. And you're inviting me," Liam finished. Ashford smiled. "We'd be honored to have you attend." It would be a chance for you to share your story, to show the community how far you've come. Liam was silent for a moment, his mind spinning. A charity gala. He could already picture it. Men in suits, women in glittering gowns, champagne glasses clinking as they exchanged empty pleasantries. He thought of the mansion. He thought of Richard and Catherine Whitmore. Will the Whitmores be there? Liam asked, his voice calm. Ashford blinked, clearly surprised by the question. The Whitmores? Yes, of course. They attend every year. They're one of the city's most prominent families. Liam's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then I'll be there. The night of the gala arrived quickly. Liam stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, adjusting the collar of his perfectly tailored suit. It was dark, sleek, and fit him like a second skin. He looked different now, older, stronger. His face was sharper, his posture confident. The boy who had once stood in the rain, clutching flowers, was gone. But as Liam stared at his reflection, he felt a pang of something deep inside him. A memory, a whisper from the past. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, faded flower. It was pressed between two pieces of parchment, a single bloom from the bouquet he had once carried to the Whitmore's doorstep. He held it gently, his fingers brushing over the petals. One day, he whispered to himself, repeating the words he had sworn years ago. One day, I'll show them. He slipped the flower back into his pocket, straightened his tie, and turned toward the door. Tonight was the night. The city was alive that evening, its streets glimmering with light as carriages and luxury cars rolled toward the grand hall where the charity gala was being held. Liam stood just outside the entrance, staring up at the towering building, its golden windows glowing like a beacon against the night sky. He could hear the hum of voices inside, polished, rehearsed, perfect. For a moment, Liam closed his eyes and exhaled. He remembered standing in the rain all those years ago, his tattered coat heavy on his shoulders, flowers slipping from his hands. He remembered the slam of the Whitmore's door, the sting of rejection that had burned through him like fire. But tonight wasn't about anger or vengeance. It wasn't even about them. It was about him, about how far he had come, about the boy who had refused to let the world crush him. Liam straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and walked through the massive double doors. Inside, the gala was exactly as Liam had imagined. The grand hall was a glittering masterpiece, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings, and tables draped in white silk. Guests floated across the room in fine gowns and tailored suits, their laughter and conversation mingling with the soft strains of classical music playing in the background. Liam stepped inside, his presence turning a few heads. He noticed the way some people looked at him, curious, intrigued, trying to figure out who he was. They didn't recognize him, of course. How could they? The boy in the rain had become a man in a suit, his confidence radiating like quiet thunder. Mr. Liam. Liam turned to see Robert Ashford, the gala's organizer, striding toward him with a wide smile. Ashford shook Liam's hand enthusiastically. I'm so glad you made it. You're exactly the kind of success story this event needs. Thank you for the invitation, Liam said politely, though his gaze scanned the room for familiar faces. Ashford followed his line of sight, clearly eager to show Liam off. Let me introduce you to a few of the evening's sponsors. Liam allowed Ashford to lead him across the room. He was introduced to businessmen, politicians, and socialites, each of them smiling and shaking his hand with an air of practiced politeness. It's impressive what you've built, one man remarked, his voice full of admiration. The factory's success is being talked about all over the city. Hard work pays off, Liam replied simply, his tone measured. As the introductions continued, Liam caught sight of a couple standing near the far end of the hall, sipping champagne and laughing quietly with a small group of guests. Richard and Catherine Whitmore. Liam froze for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around the glass of water he held. They looked exactly as he remembered, elegant, polished, untouchable. Richard's silver hair gleamed under the lights, and Catherine was draped in a gown that looked like it had been sewn from starlight. Liam felt a strange mix of emotions rise in his chest. Anger, yes, but also something softer, something closer to pity. For all their wealth and grandeur, they looked tired. Richard's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Catherine's laughter felt brittle, like glass that might shatter at any moment. Are you all right, Mr. Liam? Ashford asked, noticing Liam's sudden silence. Liam forced a small smile, his composure returning instantly. I'm fine. Who are they? he asked, gesturing subtly toward the Whitmores, though he already knew the answer. Ashford followed his gaze. That's Richard and Catherine Whitmore. You've heard of them, I'm sure. One of the wealthiest families in the city. Yes, Liam said softly. I've heard of them. As the evening wore on, Liam stayed mostly to himself, watching the room with quiet patience. He didn't approach the Whitmores. He didn't need to, not yet. He wanted to see them, to observe them as they held court among the other guests. Richard, as always, was charming, though Liam could see cracks in the facade. When one guest asked about his business, Richard's smile faltered for a split second before he launched into a rehearsed answer. We're just facing a few setbacks. Nothing we can't handle. Catherine, meanwhile, looked distracted, her eyes darting around the room as though she was searching for something, or someone. Liam leaned against one of the marble columns, his arms crossed as he watched them. He wondered if they ever thought of him, if they remembered the small boy on their doorstep, his clothes soaked and his face streaked with tears. Did they regret what they'd done? Did they even care? Excuse me, Mr. Liam. Liam turned to find a waiter standing beside him, holding out a note on a silver tray. A guest requested I deliver this to you. Liam frowned slightly, but took the note. He unfolded the small slip of paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. We need to speak. I know who you are. His gaze shot toward the far side of the room, where Richard Whitmore was watching him intently. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Liam saw it recognition. Richard knew. Liam's heartbeat quickened, but he kept his expression calm. He folded the note neatly, slipping it into his jacket pocket, and pushed himself off the column. It was time. Liam made his way across the room, weaving through groups of guests who were too busy laughing and toasting to notice him. When he reached the Whitmores, they were standing by a large window that overlooked the city's skyline. Catherine's eyes flicked to Liam as he approached, her brow furrowing slightly. Excuse me, Liam said smoothly, his voice even. I believe you wanted to speak with me. Richard turned, his expression guarded but curious. You're Liam, is that right? The young businessman everyone's been talking about. That's right, Liam replied, holding Richard's gaze. Richard studied him, his eyes narrowing as though trying to solve a puzzle. You look familiar. Liam's lips twitched into the faintest smile. Do I? Catherine tilted her head, her blue eyes sharp as they scanned his face. Have we met before? Liam let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. Yes, he said softly. A long time ago. Richard frowned, clearly unsettled. Where? You probably don't remember, Liam continued, his voice calm but steady. But I remember you. He turned his gaze to Catherine. Both of you. Catherine's face paled slightly, the color draining from her cheeks. I don't understand. Liam reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded flower, the one he had kept all these years. He held it out to them, his expression unreadable. Recognition flashed across Catherine's face first. Her eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered, It can't be. Richard looked at the flower, then back at Liam, his face going pale. You, he said, his voice hoarse. You were the boy. Liam nodded, his voice quiet but firm. I was. The room seemed to go silent around them, as though the world itself had stopped to listen. Richard and Catherine stared at Liam, the weight of recognition settling over them like a stone. You left me standing in the rain, Liam said softly, his gaze never wavering. Do you remember? Catherine didn't speak. Her lips trembled as she turned her face away, her eyes shimmering with something close to tears. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Liam slid the flower back into his pocket and straightened his shoulders. I didn't come here for an apology, he said calmly. I just wanted you to know. With that, Liam turned and walked away, leaving Richard and Catherine standing frozen by the window, the weight of the past crashing down on them. Liam walked away from Richard and Catherine Whitmore, his steps slow and deliberate. The gala buzzed around him as if nothing had happened, the chatter of guests and clinking of glasses continuing uninterrupted. But for Liam, everything felt still. Quiet. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could still see the look on their faces, Richard's stunned silence, Catherine's trembling hand covering her mouth. For all their wealth, for all their power, they had looked so small. For years, Liam had imagined this moment. He had replayed it in his mind like a scene in a movie, building it up until it was larger than life. But now that it had come, Liam felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Instead, there was an emptiness he hadn't expected. Liam! The voice broke through his thoughts, and Liam turned to see Robert Ashford hurrying toward him, looking concerned. Is everything all right? You seem distracted back there. Liam offered a faint smile, his expression unreadable. Everything's fine. I just needed some air. Ashford studied him for a moment, clearly unsure, but then he nodded. Understandable. These events can be overwhelming. Yes, Liam agreed quietly. They can. Ashford clapped him on the shoulder with a smile. I hope you'll stay for the rest of the evening. There are plenty of people who'd love to meet you. I'll think about it, Liam replied, though he already knew he wouldn't. Ashford turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Liam standing near one of the hall's tall windows. He looked out at the city below, the skyline glittering against the darkness, and exhaled slowly. Was this what closure was supposed to feel like? Richard and Catherine remained rooted in place by the window, their shock still etched onto their faces. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. It's him. It's really him. Richard didn't respond. He was staring at the floor, his brow furrowed as though he were trying to piece together how this had happened, how the small, soaked boy they had turned away had become the man standing before them now. How could we not have known? Catherine pressed, her voice rising slightly, almost frantic. He was right there, Richard. And we... Stop, Richard cut her off, his tone sharp. He looked up at her, his face pale but resolute. I don't want to talk about it. But don't you see? Catherine whispered. He remembers us. He remembers what we did. And now he's successful, Richard finished bitterly. He's more successful than I am. Catherine flinched at the words, the truth hitting her like a slap. How could this happen? Richard shook his head slowly. I don't know. But we let him in once, and we chose to turn him away. The weight of that choice settled over both of them like a lead blanket. The boy they had dismissed as worthless had built something they couldn't even comprehend. And now, standing in their presence, he had reminded them of who they had been and who they still were. Maybe we were wrong, Catherine said softly, her voice full of regret. Richard didn't respond. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. Liam left the gala without another word. The air outside was cold and crisp, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the grand hall behind him. He didn't call for a carriage. Instead, he walked, his shoes echoing on the cobbled streets as he made his way through the city. The lights of the buildings blurred in his vision, the distant hum of the world carrying on around him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded flower, holding it carefully between his fingers. It had been years since that night, the night he stood in the rain, clutching those flowers, pleading for even a shred of acknowledgement. They don't matter anymore, Liam whispered to himself, his voice steady. Not anymore. But as much as he wanted to believe it, the ache in his chest still lingered. He thought about Richard and Catherine. Their stunned faces burned into his memory. He had wanted to prove something to them for so long, to show them that he was more than what they had seen that day. And now he had. But it didn't change the past. The next morning, Liam sat in his office at the factory, staring out the window as the machines roared to life below. The factory floor was a hive of activity, his workers moving quickly and efficiently to meet the growing demand for their goods. It should have made him proud. It did make him proud. But he couldn't stop thinking about the Whitmores. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, Liam called. The door opened, and Mr. Hawthorne stepped inside, holding a small envelope in his hand. This was delivered for you, sir. From the Whitmores. Liam's expression didn't change, though his heart gave a strange lurch. Leave it on the desk, Hawthorne. Thank you. Hawthorne nodded and placed the envelope on the corner of Liam's desk before quietly exiting the room. For a long moment, Liam didn't move. He simply stared at the envelope, his mind spinning. Finally, he reached out and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The paper was expensive, the Whitmore's family crest stamped on the back. Liam slid his thumb under the seal and opened it. Inside was a short, handwritten note. Liam, we owe you an apology, though I doubt it will ever be enough. We didn't know who you were that night. We didn't see you. We're sorry. Richard Whitmore. Liam read the words twice, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he folded the note and set it aside. It didn't matter. Not really. Words couldn't change what had happened, and they couldn't erase the years he'd spent alone, fighting to survive. But something inside him felt lighter, as though a piece of the weight he'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. A week later, Liam stood outside the mansion. It looked smaller now, less intimidating. The grand doors were the same, the brass lion knocker gleaming in the sunlight. But the power they held over him was gone. Liam reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded flower one last time. He stepped forward and placed it carefully on the doorstep, right where he had stood all those years ago. It wasn't a gesture of anger or revenge. It wasn't even for the Whitmores. It was for him, a symbol of everything he had overcome. As Liam turned and walked away, he didn't look back. The mansion, the rejection, the pain, it was all behind him now. He was free. And for the first time in his life, Liam knew exactly who he was. He was strong. He was worthy. And he mattered. The weeks passed quietly after Liam's final visit to the Whitmores' mansion. He had left the flower there, the symbol of his closure, and walked away with no regrets. The chapter was closed. Life at the factory continued to thrive, and so did Liam. His business expanded further, his reputation growing as one of the sharpest minds in the city. People respected him now. They admired him. They wanted to work with him, to learn from him. But for all his success, Liam remained humble. He hadn't forgotten where he came from. On a cold morning, Liam stood on the balcony of his office building, gazing out at the city's skyline. It was a sight he had never grown tired of. Those towering buildings, the movement of people, the sound of opportunity carried on the wind. The door to his office opened, and Hawthorne entered, his usual composed expression slightly brighter than normal. "Sir, there's someone here to see you," Hawthorne announced. "Who is it?" Liam asked, turning away from the balcony. Hawthorne hesitated for a moment. "It's Richard and Catherine Whitmore." Liam blinked, surprised. "What?" "They're in the lobby," Hawthorne confirmed. "Shall I send them away?" Liam was quiet for a moment. He thought of the note they had sent him weeks ago, the apology, the words that had come too late but still carried weight. He thought of the flower he had left on their doorstep, his final act of letting go. "No," Liam said finally. "Send them up." Hawthorne nodded and exited the office. Liam turned back to the window, his hands resting on the railing as he watched the city below. He wasn't nervous. The anger and bitterness he once held had been replaced with something else, peace. When the office door opened again, Richard and Catherine Whitmore entered. They looked different now, their once perfect facade showing cracks. Richard's posture wasn't as rigid, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. Catherine's elegance was still evident, but her expression was softer, the sharpness in her eyes replaced by something more vulnerable. "Mr. Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore," Liam said evenly, turning to face them. "Please have a seat." Richard hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward. "Thank you," he said quietly. He and Catherine lowered themselves into the chairs opposite Liam's desk. Liam sat down, his expression calm and unreadable. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. "We weren't sure you would see us." "I wasn't sure either," Liam replied simply. Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Liam, I don't know where to begin. What we did, what we said to you that day, there's no excuse." Catherine nodded, her voice trembling. "We treated you horribly. You were just a child, and we turned you away. I can't stop thinking about it." Liam leaned back in his chair, studying them. He could see it now, the guilt weighing on them, the regret they carried. A younger version of himself might have relished this moment, might have wanted to see them suffer. But that wasn't who Liam was anymore. "I've spent years wondering why," Liam said softly. "Why you couldn't see me. Why you couldn't see any worth in a small boy standing in the rain." Richard's face paled, his jaw tightening. "We were blind," he admitted. "Blind and arrogant. We didn't think. We didn't care to think." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "We can't take it back. I wish we could, but we can't. All we can say is that we're sorry." Liam was silent for a long moment. He thought about the boy he used to be, the one who had been ignored, dismissed, and humiliated. He thought about the years of struggle, the nights spent hungry and cold, the countless hours of work that had brought him here. and he thought about the man he had become, the man who had proven, not to the Whitmores but to himself, that he was worthy. "You're right," Liam said finally, his voice calm. "You can't take it back. But I don't need you." Richard and Catherine both stared at him, surprised. "I thought I wanted this moment for so long," Liam continued. "To see you sitting here, to hear you say you were wrong. But now that it's here, I don't need your apology. I don't need anything from you." Richard looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I understand. But I'll tell you this," Liam said, leaning forward slightly. "You taught me something valuable that day, even if you didn't mean to. You taught me that people will try to define you, to tell you who you are and what you're worth. And you taught me that you can't let them." Catherine wiped at her eyes, her voice soft. "We're so sorry, Liam." Liam nodded once. "I believe you. But you don't need to carry this forever either. Let it go." The room was quiet again, the weight of Liam's words settling over all of them. Richard stood slowly, his movements careful. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "You're a better man than I ever was." Liam didn't respond, but his calm gaze followed them as they turned and left the office. When the door closed behind them, Liam exhaled deeply, feeling as though a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying had finally been lifted. That evening, Liam walked through the city streets, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above him. He passed by shops and bakeries, their windows glowing with warm light, and eventually found himself standing outside the library where he used to spend so much time. The building looked the same as it always had, solid and comforting, a place of endless possibility. Liam smiled faintly and stepped inside. Mrs. Kearns, the kind librarian who had once saved books just for him, was still there, sorting through a stack of papers at the front desk. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Liam," she exclaimed, "it's been so long. Look at you." Liam smiled back, warmth filling his chest. "Hello, Mrs. Kearns." She shook her head in amazement. "You've come so far, my boy. I always knew you would." Liam looked around at the shelves lined with books, the familiar scent of old paper filling the air. "I couldn't have done it without this place," he said quietly. Mrs. Kearns beamed. "And you'll inspire so many others to do the same." Liam nodded, his smile soft. That was his new goal, to help others. To make sure that no other child ever felt as small and invisible as he once had. As Liam walked out of the library and into the night, he thought about his journey. The mansion, the rejection, the years of struggle. But none of it defined him. Liam had proven his worth, not to the Whitmores, not to the city, but to himself. And that was enough. The stars shone brightly above him, and for the first time, Liam felt like he belonged in the world. He was strong. He was worthy. And he mattered.